Hello, everyone. This is the first episode of the podcast, Everything About You Matters, a relational, holistic, clinical social work practice podcast. My aim with my guests is to discover the myriad ways clinical social workers make sense of the human experience and build toward a more just world, one person, family, and community at a time. I'm your host, Lance Peterson, a licensed independent clinical social worker and social work professor in the Morrison Family College of Health School of Social Work at the University of St. Thomas. Today's episode is ambitious as my guest and I try to expound on the concept of clinical social work. What is clinical social work, and how do social workers engage clinically in such a way that makes their practice relational and holistic? These are not simple questions and are unlikely to be answered in one episode. The world of clinical social work practice is complicated by systems that prioritize profit over people, limit access to populations seeking services, and continue to stigmatize help-seeking behavior as weakness. However, diving into these questions can help create rich discussions in classrooms and beyond to understand the unique role clinical social work plays in improving the human condition. As it happens, I have someone I believe is uniquely situated in her ongoing practice as well as practice history to help us understand these questions. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome my former colleague and ongoing good friend, Jane Hurley-Johncox, MSW, LICSW. Jane brings over 30 years of clinical experience working with individuals, families, and adolescents as they navigate complex personal, relational, and systemic challenges. Her clinical specialties include depression, anxiety, chemical health, attachment-related concerns, grief and loss, and work with survivors of trauma, neglect, and abuse. Jane has held various clinical and leadership roles, including therapist, clinical supervisor, and clinical director, and has been actively involved in designing, implementing, and evaluating programs. She was a clinical supervisor for an intensive day treatment and multisystemic therapy program. Additionally, she collaborated with William Mitchell College of Law to provide therapeutic support to women transitioning from the Minnesota Correctional Facility, Shakopee. She is a board-certified clinical supervisor with the Minnesota Board of Social Work and is deeply committed to mentoring and educating future clinicians. Jane served as clinical faculty at the University of St. Thomas for over 20 years and is now professor emeritus. She practices privately in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she continues to offer trauma-informed, relationally focused care grounded in compassion, clinical excellence, and respect for the resilience of those she serves. Jane, welcome to Everything About You Matters. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Wow, thank you, Lance. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so happy to be able to do this work. It's been wonderful to anticipate this podcast and prepare. You said send me a short bio, and that is, but it just speaks to how long I've been doing the work. And now I should update. It's probably like closer to 36 years. Inching into 40. So I was just kind of laughing to myself as you were reading that long, short bio of everything that I've done. But it's such an honor to be here, and it's such an honor to be able to work with you on this project, and hopefully we can have a really great conversation about clinical social work practice.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the honor goes both ways. That litany of things that define your clinical practice is exactly why I thought you would be a very well-suited guest for the podcast. Speaking of which, per your we're going to go ahead and get into this. So, per your biography, you have had a rich history of clinical social work experience. Will you please begin by informing our audience about areas of clinical social work experience you have had throughout your career?
Yes, most definitely. I want to go back to the beginning because it's kind of interesting how my work unfolded, and in a weird way, it kind of chose me. For example, I started my work when I completed my undergraduate working in the juvenile justice system, and that was something that I never thought I would do. I ended up falling into an interview where I met an incredible woman who had been coordinating field opportunities, and I did my undergrad field placement in juvenile justice and ended up falling in love with it. Also, really understanding the complexity and the need for social workers to be working in that field, in particular as it relates to social, racial, and economic justice and everything else that goes with that. So a lot of people were sort of confused. It's like, how did a social worker end up in the juvenile justice system? Isn't that an oppressive system? And aren't you oppressing people? And it's like, well, that's one way to look at it. Or you can be going in and taking a look at it as an opportunity for change. So I worked as, at a bachelor's level for about 3 years and quickly decided that I needed to go back to grad school. So I went and got my MSW and then stayed working in the juvenile justice system, but had an opportunity to really expand the kind of work that I did. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, and then you can ask me questions along the way, because there's a lot to be said about what I did. But almost immediately following completing my graduate work, I applied for and got the job to develop a program, a community-based program, implementing cognitive skills groups and restorative justice programming in the community corrections organization that I was working at. And that was in the early 90s, so that was really innovative work for the community corrections to be taking this kind of stance, to be looking at restorative justice and also community-based programming instead of focusing more on what we used to talk in corrections. It was called like trail, nail, jail. So very different to start thinking about how can we reduce risk factors, how can we increase skills and competencies, and set people that are justice involved up for success instead of having them leave the system worse off than when they entered. So I developed this cognitive behavioral program, really not really knowing much at all about cognitive behavioral interventions other than what I had learned in grad school. So it became a quick study and scurrying around trying to find effective programs, some that were developed and then others that I developed by doing the research and piecing it together. It was a really incredible opportunity. I worked with about 7 other people. I oversaw the implementation of those programs, and it ended up that it was quite a success, both with adults and juveniles. We were doing this community-based programming with people where they would come into the office, and we had very low attrition, high attendance, and some great outcomes in terms of recidivism. We didn't do long-term follow-ups, but just initially like a significant reduction in violations, a significant reduction in reoffending, and then also building the relationship. You talk about relationship-focused, holistic work. And to me, that's the center of it. A story came to mind as I was reflecting on this, and I had done a group with a group of men who either could have gone and served time in jail or come to the community-based group. So as you can imagine, many of them chose the group. And so getting them engaged in the process and taking a look at the sequences that lead to their behavior, with this particular group, they were men that were involved in felony-level domestic violence charges. Wow. So working with them, getting them to understand the emotions, the sequences that lead to the aggressive behavior, all those types of skill development, insight development. And I remember back then we were still working on pagers, and one of the men in the group paged me, and it was like an SOS page, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he got picked up. And he called me, and he was totally dysregulated and super upset. And he said, oh my God, I saw my ex-partner. I was driving down the road, and I started chasing after her, and I'm like, okay, and then what? And then I was speeding behind her, and I'm like, okay, and then what? Waiting to hear, and then I got arrested. And then I pulled over on the side of the road, and I did some breathing exercises, and I decided not to pursue it. And I was aware that I was reenacting some of those really jealous and out of control behaviors that we had been working on. So, I mean, it's like, and those kinds of stories stand out for you because they don't happen a lot. And I'm like, oh, this is really cool. So then I went on and continued to do community-based programming because I didn't really want to be involved in the institutions, like the detention facilities or the jails or the prisons, but really, really had a passion for doing the community-based work. So from there, I moved into the role as the clinical director for an intensive day treatment program that worked with high-risk kids, men, boys, between the ages of 12 and 17, who were either going to go to long-term day treatment or into residential. So I always had a little bit of an up because their other choice was always a little bit worse, which probably helped with some of our success. And these were boys between 12 and 17, and they were with us from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m., 6 days a week. So we took up all their time. They went to school, they did mental health treatment, they did groups, They did community work service. They did all kinds of programming. And we also taught them how to play, because many of these kids never knew how to play. So we'd go out sliding, we'd do all kinds of activities. And lots of times people say, why are we doing this for these kids? They're just as involved. I mean, like, because they never learned how to play. And this is a protective factor. Again, relational and holistic for them to get involved in these types of things. Then, did you have a question?
Yeah, really quick, just to bounce off of that and say that just is also trying to sort of re-engage their development, right? Because if you don't learn how to play, or if there are certain developmental milestones you don't meet, they're going to catch up with you sometime later in life. This is
I'm so glad that you said that, because I was thinking, as I was thinking about one of the theories that I work through is trauma. And one of the big ones is understanding development. And when development isn't on track, it's a good assessment that there's trauma. So there's a perfect example that their development was not on track because of their trauma histories. And we were teaching them that developmental repair. That's so beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And then in addition to that, I was given the charge of finding an intensive in-home family program, because we were operating from the belief that you don't just intervene with the kid, we need to intervene with the entire system, which is really good social work practice and very holistic and very relational. And so in my research, I found multisystemic therapy. And it was super exciting, because I know you and I have talked about this. And what I noticed right away and said, and some people appreciated and others didn't, that all this really is really great social work practice. And it really was based on, those core principles of, the socio-ecological, the systems, the strength-based, the empowerment, the problem-solving, the crisis, the person and environment, all those key pieces. And then a big piece of it came from Uri Fennenbrenner's work about that socio-ecological model. And what I loved about it when I first looked at it is at the center of the ring is the child, and then the next ring is the family, and then the next ring is the school, and then the next ring is the community, and the next ring is if you're involved in any kind of church or synagogue or religious practice, and then all these rings, and then at the very outside were the professionals.
This actually builds to a question I had, which was about multisystemic therapy. And again, you and I have talked about this a lot. For our listeners, can you, when you say it is just good social work practice, can you describe a little bit about that process?
Yeah.
Here I'm thinking both about not only what you do, but all of the supervision that's entailed with it. Could you describe that process a little bit?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I learned so much as a result of being involved. The MST program does such a beautiful job providing training and support and information before they'll even let you hit the ground running, because they're super into model fidelity. And so, which is great, you learn a ton before you get into it. But essentially, what it is a full-time caseload is 4 to 6 families. So essentially, you are doing exactly what Minuchin talked about in his structural family therapy model, is you join the family, and you literally join the family. You're practically living with them, because you're spending 10 hours a week with them. You're cooking meals, you're playing games, you're doing projects, and you're also doing, interventions, family interventions. So that's a really big part of it. So just to start out with, your caseload is very, very small for that very reason, because you got to join, you got to build the relationship, you got to gain the trust. Unfortunately, many of the families that we worked with were already system involved and had a very low trust. So just trying to give them a corrective experience with the system, letting them know that we were really there to set them up for success, not to try to any way undermine them. And also one of the basic premises is that the parents are the experts, not that the parents are pathological or some other pejorative term that so often is used for families that are struggling. And so just to give them that corrective experience was just, amazing. And then the other thing that you were mentioning is that there's 3 levels of structure and accountability. So you have, the other thing is super intensive supervision. So each week I would do individual supervision with each therapist, and then we would do weekly supervision for about 4 hours as a group, starting with group supervision, and then we would have our consultant from MST Services sit in and review everything that we had just reviewed in terms of that fidelity and making sure that the model, it was the transportability of the MST model in action. And the only way that you can get that to happen is with that level of accountability. And that's what came out of the National Institute of Mental Health, is that, and based on their research, is that the supervisor plays the most critical role in terms of model fidelity, even more than the therapist, which is just another really great reason to really invest a lot in clinical supervision, because it sets the clinicians then up for success. So they did things that were called, let's see if I'm going to get this right, TAMS, SAMs, and CAMs. And those were the adherence measures. So the TAM was the therapist adherence measure. So MST Services would call the families to see how much the therapists were adhering to the model. Then they would call the therapist and get a SAM, which is a supervisor adherence measure. And then they would call the team to get a CAM, to get a consultant adherence measure to the model. So we were constantly, being held accountable. Our work was constantly being reviewed. Some might call that micromanagement. I really called it professional growth and development, because it taught me so much about every aspect of doing intensive family systems work and family therapy in a way that I don't think I would have been able to without that level of support and supervision. And they did a huge transportability study, and they found, which is no surprise, that the stronger the adherence, the better the outcomes, right?
Well, what's interesting too, that because when I was thinking about that, you could look at it as micromanaging, but the thing that kind of stood out to me as you were saying that is, I think of all the meetings where you think you're communicating about the same thing, but you're not. But when you have all that accountability in place, I would imagine the communication just rises to a new level in terms of really being on board, ultimately for the family, which that's what you should be doing anyway.
That's exactly right. And the way that it worked is we had to do updated paperwork every week, providing progress on all of our goals and whether or not they're met, unmet, in progress. And if they weren't met, then we had to do what's called a fit circle to understand the drivers of why whatever it is continuing. So if it's substance use, truancy, conflict in the home, because if the behaviors aren't shifting, then we're not targeting the right drivers. So the therapist would get me all their paperwork the day before we would meet. I would go over all the paperwork before we met. We'd review all the paperwork in supervision, then we'd review all the paperwork again in consultation. And then the consultant would review all the paperwork that I had reviewed to see if there was anything else that could be added, or if we were converged on where we were headed on the cases. And again, it just made us better. It just made us more polished in terms of our intervention, hence getting better outcomes with the families that we were working with.
That makes a lot of sense. And because the thing I'm remembering too is you certainly have sort of those intrafamilial things that you're focusing on, like the substance use or the family conflict or whatever it is. And as I recall, when I've talked with you about MST in the past, there can also be systems that you may approach.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the other thing that I love about MST, which I think aligns so beautifully with social work and social work practice, is that the entire system is the client. So if it's the school, if it's the justice system, if it's a mental health or a child protection social worker, anybody that interacts with that family system is part of the client system. And so we would spend time in all of those areas, with juvenile judges, with child protection workers, with children's mental health workers, with, schools, so much time at schools, because oftentimes not only was the child having trouble with a strong school-child link, there was often a very weak parent-school link for all the obvious reasons. So we would strengthen that link to give them a corrective experience working with the school, and the school a corrective experience working with the parents, and that would set the kid up for success. And of course, just like any systemic intervention, the parents had a much greater impact on that school family link than the kid did, because they just have more power and more influence. So the more we could get the parents actively involved, the better outcomes we got with the kids being successful at school. Not only that, we would target mentors and supports and ways of changing their schedules that just might make getting to school a little easier, and being creative about those kinds of things. So yeah, interventions across the board. It was very busy work. We were out and about in the community all the time and reaching out to any, major system that that kid was interacting with.
And we touched on this a little bit. You talked about, it's called goodness of fit. Is that what
Yes.
it's?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really this idea that if you're struggling to make progress with that client, that you start thinking about what are we missing here within
That's
the
right.
different systems, or the different things that are happening in this
Right.
child's world. And I say child because it's 12 to 17-year-olds.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so what's really cool about that is that ties in very closely with a lot of the DBT, because what we were constantly doing were the chain analyses. So it's the sequence of the events that led to the behavior.
And just for our listeners, dialectical behavior therapy.
Yes, sorry.
DBT.
Yep. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that too. But so instead of focusing on the behavior, which we always want to do, the kids smoking pot, the kids skipping school, the kids being assaultive, whatever the kid is doing, if all we're focusing is on the behavior, we've missed the opportunity, right? So we want to back that train way up and figure out what are all the sequences that happen before that. What are the drivers? And that's called a fit circle. So you're doing a fit, or creating an understanding of all the drivers and all the sequences, and then you teach the family how to do it. So pretty soon they're doing fit circles, and they're engaged in the process and trying to understand, okay, and it's never just one thing, right? Like we would come up with, maybe 10 drivers, and it's like we only get to come up with like 3 individual drivers, and then we got to start coming up with some family drivers, and we got to come up with some systems drivers, because it's not just the kid, right? There's a lot of things at play. And then we want to be investigators doing a chain analysis of the sequences, that events that led to the physical altercation, because there's a lot that happens. And the earlier we would intervene, then we can circumvent the very behaviors that were problematic from happening in the first place. And that to me is really exciting, because you get some really great outcomes, and then people understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And when I say people, the people you're working with, and schools and judges, and everybody is involved in that.
Well, and that's, I think, really epitomizes that holistic relational way of doing social work practice, which I think comes back to full circle to you saying MST is just good social work practice, right?
Exactly.
And, want to just recognize, I think it's unfortunate, but our systems are not really set up like MST. MST is really, it's sort of its own thing, and it would be really nice to see more, more development after that pattern of MST, for the very reasons that you brought
Right,
up.
and like anything else, it's kind of waxed and waned, because I first started working with this in the late 90s, and I think it's had surges and then back and then surges and back, kind of depending on what's going on in the context in which we're doing our work, which, after however many years, 36 years, I've seen a lot of waxing and waning. And I think the selling point is that it's very cost efficient if you consider the alternative residential care.
Yes.
And many of these kids, we were working with the high-end kids. We weren't working with kids that were low risk, because those kids don't need interventions. They've got enough protective factors in place that we don't even touch them. In fact, the research suggests if you bring those kids further into the justice system, it actually makes them worse, which is why sometimes when people say we got to hit these kids hard, fast on the front end, it's like, oh, no, you don't want to. You've got to assess the entire system to determine, the protective and risk factors. And of course, there's a lot that goes into that too, right? Because sometimes you're what you're engaging in just is going to get a correctional response regardless of your system. And of course, then there's privilege attached to, I mean, there's all kinds of layers that are attached to that too. So I have to be very quick to state that too, because you don't want to end up reinforcing a system that is geared towards supporting, people of affluence and resources and those types of things, because you can have a lot of those same protective factors at every level in every situation, or you can work to build them. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, something you talked about in terms of that sort of impulse for juvenile correction or any kind of correction is you stop the behavior, right? And this is so much more expansive than that. It's okay, let's figure out why the behavior is happening, and let's look at all the factors associated with that and target those things. And then the behaviors will eventually take care of themselves. And not to say that you don't focus anything on behaviors, but that there are all of these other factors that you really want to consider when you're working with these children.
Right, and it's really exciting when the interventions work.
Yeah.
Because you've targeted the right drivers.
Yeah. One thing you said, I was thinking when you talked about resources, because I know the families that are often worked with in MST are resource deprived. They're not affluent families typically.
Not always, though. I mean, it's kind of surprising. Sometimes there is affluence. Yeah.
So I guess my question is for those who are more resource deprived, does even in the context of MST, does that also factor in terms of getting them resources that can help them, whether that's, okay, so that is part of the model.
That's what I love too, because I was, doing some reflection on what is clinical social work practice, because that's what we're talking about. And I think clinical social work practice includes advocacy when necessary. And that's what I love about being a clinical social worker, because it is about advocating, and it's about getting people connected to the resources so that you set them up for success. So we used to have a mug, but it came from MST Services, and on the mug it says whatever it takes. Mm-hmm. And then that would get passed around for whoever went above and beyond the call of duty to do whatever it took to get people success, or at least set them up for success. And some people would call that enabling. We call it assertive care, because there were times where if you just intervened right at that moment, you could avoid a hospitalization. Or if you just intervened right at that moment, you could avoid a lot of crisis and chaos. So we were a 24/7, 7-day-a-week program. So we were on call, and we would sometimes handle the crisis on the phone, but there were other times where sometimes we had to go out to the family and do an intervention, hence receiving the whatever it takes mug, but also preventing a major, another rupture, another placement, and all of those disrupt successes.
Yeah.
As you're moving forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What's an example of a way that you did resource a family? I'm assuming it could be health insurance. It could be food, some kind of food security system. What were
all of those types of
okay.
things. Yeah, and then even getting them more community involved, because oftentimes they're very isolated. Mm-hmm. So some of that community networking. We used to do interventions with other families of kids and their families, and because that's part of the system, right?
Right.
And getting them connected, and we'd have these parents start to talk to one another, and then they'd find out that they were all feeling the same way and feeling pretty isolated, and sometimes pointing the finger at each other, right? Mm-hmm. It's your kid, only to find out that really they can be great resources in terms of that increased accountability and monitoring and support, instead of doing it all on your own. Any additional support services, any of those types of things. But first and foremost, the MST therapist is the one that's supposed to be doing all the interventions. So not necessarily referring them to other like service providers, but other community, building that community support in whatever way made sense based on the individual family.
And just a little plug for that too. It's a reminder that the further one gets isolated, the easier it is to stay in isolation. But the only antidote is really to get out of that and to to engage with your community, engage with the people around you.
Yeah, and break through the shame and the pain of
Yes.
having to do that work and this belief that you're the only one and somehow I'm a bad parent. All that internalized messaging that comes with that. And it's also what we put on families. I mean, it's really okay, it's sanctioned to use pejorative terms towards families that are involved in these systems. And it's really important that we don't, because they're just regular people trying to do the best job they can with what they have and just need to learn to do a little better, just like we all do.
Thank you for that. I think that is such an important takeaway from our conversation, because that is something I ran into a lot too. And it always made me uncomfortable when we talked about families as, quote unquote, the problem, the parents as the problem, because it doesn't, it was a way of really, I mean, when you think about it, it actually further can rupture a relationship with the child, even if the child's not having a good experience with their parent. It's still their parent.
That's right. That's right. Because if you're not going to work with those parents, you really can't work with the kid. Yeah. So just to kind of keep moving along, then what I did is I moved into community-based services, but I brought the MST program with me from the intensive day treatment program. And from there, I did some more creating of intensive case management models and using the work of William Miller in motivational interviewing, because a lot of the people that were working with the kids and families, had a bachelor's level degree, maybe in a whole nother, history or criminal justice, where they haven't been trained in some of those skills. So we decided to get them trained in those skills. And then also we were talking about the fact of like solution-focused strategies. So I had the opportunity to do training with Insoo Kimberg and Steve Deschager, I can never say his name quite right, and implementing, instead of being so problem-focused, how to be solution-focused. So for example, a big issue is chemical health and, using substances. And instead of talking about, let's talk about your use, let's talk about when you use, let's talk about how you use, it would be, let's talk about a time when you weren't using. And let's talk about how that went. And let's talk about what was in place when you were able to not use. And let's talk about how we can recreate that. So it's not airy-fairy solution focused. It's very grounded on trying to figure out what was happening and getting curious about what was going on when the problem's not there, instead of spending so much time being curious about what's going on when the problem's there. I mean, you have to do both. But so we did some major, what I would say, intensive training with all of our teams of probation officers in this case management model, and then also skills. So we were doing skill development training, and that was really a lot of fun to teach and have people practice these communication and interviewing skills, to the point where we even had them recording some of their sessions and then giving feedback to them, as a form of clinical supervision to see if they're adhering to some of the models that we were putting into place. So that was a really fun project to work on, and that's how I started to go down that road of becoming more familiar with motivational interviewing, because the work that William Miller and Rolnick did was both in chemical health, but also for justice involved individuals. And then Rolnick was also in the medical field. So how to get people more engaged in the change process so that they'd be more likely to move forward with making the change that they've identified that they wanted to make, which is just perfect when you're working in this type of setting. So I had the opportunity to be involved in that.
Yeah, that I'm remembering with, part of a textbook that I use in class, Interviewing for Solutions, talking about solution-focused therapy. One of the reasons I think that it's so valuable in terms of this holistic approach is one of the first things the textbook teaches you is how is somebody not like their diagnosis, right? And to list all the ways that they're not like their diagnosis. And so it really amplifies the idea of using strengths.
Right, and aligns with those core principles of what social work practice is about. And that's the other thing too, I just want to underscore, is each time I was looking at a new model or a new program, the lens that I looked at it through was through a social work lens. And does this align with social work values and ethics to make programming and improve relationships from a holistic perspective, with families and kids that we were working with at that time. And I think everybody was more excited and more engaged when we were doing that work, even though that it was, challenging.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think because there will always be inevitable conflict, but whenever you're working with folks, but you can avoid so much conflict by emphasizing strengths and really focusing on these parts of them that they can amplify to make their lives better.
Right. And speaking of a corrective experience, you have someone who's involved in a worker, a probation officer, a case manager who is working in the criminal justice system, and they're actually trying to target your strengths. That's a completely corrective experience for them. And that's reparative. It's reparative to their development, it's reparative to their attachment, and it's reparative to their trauma. So even if you're not even aware of those deeper levels of intervention, that's what's happening. And then the other thing that I want to keep emphasizing is the need for really good clinical supervision, because that's the only way people will be successful. And as we were implementing these programs, we became very aware quickly that if the supervisors, A, weren't behind it, and B, didn't have the skill set, it didn't move forward. And so we could train the frontline staff 1,000,000 times, but if we didn't have that level of support at that supervisory level, it wouldn't launch. And then all of a sudden, the National Institute of Mental Health comes out with this article about the supervisors play the most critical role in implementing programs and model fidelity, which ties right back to MST and what they found in their research. So the need for really good quality clinical supervision, which has also been part of my work for forever. Since I got my master's degree, I've been doing supervision in one form or another, right up to doing clinical supervision for licensure and preparing people to get their clinical licenses.
I do have a couple things, but you had mentioned DBT that you wanted to bring up. So
right. Well, I think, that kind of like fast forward, then I eventually left the county and got hired full-time teaching. And I was in a clinical faculty role, so the expectation was that I would continue to do clinical work. So I continued to do clinical work. And with that, I also started my private practice. So I was still doing MST, and I worked on other projects like the William Mitchell Law School program with women coming out of Shakopee and those types of things. But also, developed a niche working with people that had complex trauma, complex attachment, and mental health issues and concerns. And that's what I saw a lot of in my practice. And I became a vetted therapist for foster. It used to be called Minnesota Adopt, but now it's called Foster Adopt Minnesota.
Okay.
So my brain twists every time. But that was because of my background working with kids, working with families, and also being able to do the parent coaching, the parent support, and also the complex attachment and trauma issues that were often associated with the families that referred to me that were struggling with, the issues related to these kids' adoptions. So I just have to say that's not true for all adoptions. It's true for the families that were referred to me. And what I realized very quickly is that I needed to expand my expertise and skills working specifically with trauma beyond just talk therapy, and you get a gut feeling. It's like, we got to do more than just talk about this. And I knew intuitively that it was happening in their bodies. I knew intuitively that it was more than just talking it through. So then I became trained in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's the work of Francine Shapiro. I was trained in that over 20 years ago, and I still use it on a regular basis. It's one of my primary tools, if it's a good fit. Mm-hmm. When I first got trained in it, I'm like, oh, here we go, Nirvana, I'm going to use this with everybody, just like anything else. No, that's not the case. But when it is a good fit, it's a great fit. And one of the things with trauma, from a theoretical perspective, is that people have to be in a regulated place and well-resourced to be able to do that work. So if you don't have good internal resourcing or good external resourcing, that is not when you start to move down the road of exploring, especially complex PTSD, because I rarely work with a one-time trauma. My work is usually related to very young childhood trauma all the way through till young adulthood and sometimes even beyond that. So what I became really aware of is I needed a tool that would help with regulation and, this nervous system activation and the dissociation and the ability to stay present and the ability to stay regulated and manage stress. And that's where DBT came in.
Sure.
So then that's when I got trained in DBT. And the target of DBT is mindfulness practice, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so what I was able to do is roll out some of those skills very intentionally and very collaboratively with individuals and groups that I was working with.
And that would be the internal resourcing, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So then you become more aware, right? Because part of what ends up happening when you are in a sort of constant vigilant stance is that you're not even aware of it. Like you are so entangled in it that you can't even see it. So part of the work is to create this capacity to, first of all, know that you're in a dysregulated state. And second of all, to do some sort of intervention before you make the problem worse. And you get yourself re-regulated and back to baseline. And then you can start to move forward. And not only with the individual, but also teaching this to families, especially parents, because they would become so frustrated with their kid for being so dysregulated 1 minute, from a very, very activated trauma response place, and then 20 minutes later ask what's for dinner. That was very confusing for them. It's like, I feel like I'm being manipulated. I feel like, they're using this to control us. And I'm like, yes, I believe that's the way it feels to be true, but that's not what's going on. This person is really experiencing this hypervigilance, this extraordinarily dysregulated state, and the only thing that we do when somebody's in that place is get them re-regulated back to baseline.
And I think it's so important for us to recognize too that trauma can be triggered through all of our senses. One of my favorite stories, very tragic story, but it's in the book What Happened to You that Oprah Winfrey wrote with Dr. Bruce Perry. And Dr. Bruce Perry talks about this child that they were struggling to figure out why he kept having these episodes of anger, like right in the middle of class. And this teacher what they found was this teacher kept getting close to him. And that's when the trigger would happen. Right. But it wasn't actually physical presence. It wasn't any of that. It was that the teacher was wearing the same cologne as the abuser that the child had previously.
Absolutely.
That's
Isn't
what they find
so powerful.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's, that's why it really changes our frame of mind if something's happening to say, oh, there must be something going on here.
Right,
really
and getting curious, right?
Right,
Let's
exactly,
get curious.
Exactly.
Let's get curious about what's going on.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'd like to take us in a slightly different direction.
Absolutely.
On that note, I was going to talk about critical self-reflection, and you just reminded me of a story, because you mentioned countertransference, which this, of course, is a psychodynamic term, but I think a pretty ubiquitous term, too, in terms of recognizing that we bring our own stuff into the work we do with clients, and that it's our responsibility to figure that out. And I remember, having a client who would get really activated and mad and talk about wanting to violently harm somebody, and I would shut down. And, and looking back, I had wished I would have processed that a little bit more in supervision. Okay, you're shutting down, so what do you need to do to stay engaged? What's happening with you? What do you need to do to stay engaged? And, as I've reflected on it, I think it was really a matter of, saying, really coming back to him and saying, where's this coming from for you? And being able to have a conversation about it. Right. But I was so activated, I couldn't do it. So.
Right. And using what I love too is that's what's so cool about psychodynamic theory and relational theory is you're using the here and now. What's happening between you and the client to talk about that. Like, whoa, I'm noticing this is what's happening. Let's talk about this. But of course, we are people. and we all have stuff. And an angry client can be a really powerful trigger for a therapist in terms of shutting down, especially if anger is kind of a scary thing, And so, but that gets back to your very point about, needing to do our own work and making sure that we are aware when we're in an activated state, because it's not like we're all of a sudden going to get to a place in our work where that doesn't happen. Mm-mm. But what it is, it's the ongoing awareness, and one thing that I really believe is the minute I go off neutral, I render myself ineffective. So if I way over like a client or way under like a client or overreacting, I got to bring myself back to neutral, right? Because we need not neutral like from a cutoff place, very open-hearted, connected, but like not having my emotions impact how I'm interacting or working with this particular client. And I have never not had a client at one given time that I'm working with that doesn't really challenge me to work on this very thing.
That's very well said. I don't think that, I would.
It's never not been a thing. It's like, oh, here we go. Here's my opportunity. And so, getting back to teaching, how we always were competencies, clinical competencies, foundation competencies for the counselor and social work education. And one thing that I would say in my courses over and over and over again is your number one competency is self-awareness. Your number one competency is your own self-awareness and doing your own work. And we can only walk and guide our clients as far as we've gone ourselves. And so we have to constantly engaging in our own growth, in terms of our own therapy, in terms of our own whatever work that we're doing, so that we can continue to be self-aware and engage in that reflective process, right? Because you were talking about the reflective process. It's like we reflect before, we reflect during, we reflect after each client session, and preparing and being intentional and present, and then also engaging in what's happening for me right now, and then also what's happening in my life right now. If we have a bunch of stuff going on with our families and then we come, we might not be as well resourced to be able to hold the complexity too. So we have to be aware of all these things.
Yeah, that's well said, which actually answers one of the questions I had about self-reflection. So I appreciate that. I don't remember. We had talked about a role play. Did you have a role play?
I did,
okay,
actually.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about my latest exploration clinically. Okay.
No, please do, because we haven't really gotten to where you're at now, which is private practice. So
right. So,
your,
ongoing training, ongoing growth, ongoing development. So I have this, I have been trained in internal family systems, which is just amazing. It's a little psychodynamic. It's a little bit cognitive behavioral. It's a little bit fabulous in terms of the work. And so I've come up with a new thing, and people will probably challenge this, which is cool. Go ahead. But I call it like cognitive behavioral 2.0.
Oh, interesting.
And what it is what I'm noticing in some of these, like Linehan's work, her first book was Cognitive Behavioral Interventions with, I think, women with borderline personality disorder. It was written in 1984. It's on my bibliography. And then as you look at DBT, there's very little CBT like in that more traditional way, like the antecedent, the beliefs and the consequences, right? So this is the activating situation. These are my beliefs, thinkings, and feelings, and this is which is great. We need to have that model in our head. But more and more and more, what I'm seeing is that these 2.0ers of CBT are really working on creating awareness and mindfulness within the individual, so they have the observing self, so they can be aware when their thoughts and their emotions are activated, and they can disentangle. So instead of like doing a replacement thought, all those activities that you would do with CBT, which I've done a lot, worked a lot with CBT, which nothing wrong with it at all. However, what's cool about this is the rewiring happens the minute you name it.
Interesting.
So you say to yourself, oh, I'm doing that thing again, whether it's an intrusive thought or a negative thought or a shame thought. But you have to have the awareness to notice, right? So work is to notice it. So you have to notice your emotions, and you have to notice your thinking, and then you have to notice how the impact that it's having on you, and you name it. And then that starts the rewiring. And it's not like you automatically feel, oh, and now I feel great. Like some mornings I'll start in these patterns and I'll have like these negative thoughts. And then I'll think to myself, oh, this is interesting. Why are these thoughts coming up today? And just be curious about it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you automatically, oh, and now I feel like $1 million, because they'll keep popping in, right? But then you just keep noticing. So it's this increasing this outside observer, this observing self. Like Linehan says, observe and describe without judgment, right? That's her thing. Or like even with acceptance and commitment therapy, they talk about the diffusion process from thoughts and feelings. And then in internal family systems, they talk about unblending, disconnecting, and having yourself, your capital S self, present, right? So each one of them are really focusing on assisting people in becoming more self-aware. And, I have a lot of little things that I say, but I say so often to people, the goal of therapy is to increase your self-awareness. And the more aware you are, the more you don't have to keep recreating these patterns. And the more you don't recreate patterns, the more agency you have in your life, and the more you're really living your life instead of living your patterns, right? So we want to be aware. So this is the 2.0 of CBT. The minute you name it, then you're doing the rewiring. Mm-hmm. So I have been doing a fair amount of training in internal family systems, yes. IFS, right? Mm-hmm. For the past 3 years, and I'm a novice, but I'm integrating it because there's a strong relationship between IFS and EMDR. Really fun. And now I'm noticing there's a bunch of trainings coming up on combining EMDR and IFS. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I love it when the research supports my, practice-informed research, research-informed practice, kind of that back and forth. So I'm like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So when I'm doing EMDR with somebody, we might switch and do some parts work, and then we might switch back and then do some more EMDR. And what I love about both of those, it's the awareness of the thoughts and feelings, but they're also very somatic. Where are you experiencing it in the body? And that's the other piece, is integrating the somatic components, which I would love to go through the full Pat Ogden somatic experiencing training, but something tells me that's probably not going to happen.
Probably not. Probably beyond the scope of the podcast.
And at this point in my career, I don't probably see me doing that level of training. So anyway, I was wondering if you wanted to do just a real brief internal family systems.
I would love it. Yeah.
Exercise.
Yep.
And I caught a cue when we talked before, and I just caught it again. So I'm going to check this out with you. And if at any time you don't want to do this, you just say no.
Okay.
You're totally in charge.
Okay.
100%.
Sounds good.
But one thing I noticed when we talked before, I just got to take a drink of water because I'm talking a lot.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Is you talked about sometimes that you might avoid conflict.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you also talked about an angry client, and then that kind of shut you down. Mm-hmm. So I have 2 pieces of data that tells me that might be something that's worth taking a look at.
Okay, sure.
What do you think? Would you agree? Are you cool with that?
Agree. Yep.
Okay. So this is the deal. What you need to know is that at any time you want to stop, we stop.
Okay.
You are 100% in charge. Okay. But what's really cool about internal family systems is they normalize, and I have trouble sometimes saying words, so it's the multiplicity within everybody. Like we all have multiple parts. And it doesn't mean that you have dissociative identity disorder. This is like we have a younger part, we have an adolescent, we have a critic, we have a...
Firefighters is one, yes.
Yeah, and our firefighters are our soothers, and sometimes they can be such soothers that they have us use drugs and alcohol, eat food, use sex, but it's immediate relief, right? Mm-hmm. And so no bad parts. We're not pathologizing any of these, but we want to work with them. We want to get to know them. So the part that I was going to see if you wanted to work with is this part that either avoids conflict sometimes or is sometimes afraid of conflict.
Okay, yeah.
Does that seem like something you might want to work on?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have no idea what we're doing, so don't worry, because you wouldn't know.
Okay.
And I'm going to gently walk you through some questions, and then you just answer, and we just see what happens.
Okay.
And it can be
Sounds good.
really powerfully beautiful process. So what I want you to do is just take a moment, and a lot of this involves closing your eyes. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's hard sometimes to get these images with our eyes open. So I want you to do is close your eyes and center your attention on this part of you that, well, what do we want to call it? Is afraid of conflict, avoids conflict? What language do you want me to use?
Yeah, we'll go with avoids
Okay,
conflict.
I want to make sure I have that right. Okay, so check in with the part of you that avoids conflict and just center your attentions on it. Like breathe it in, breathe it into your body. Taking a moment to get grounded in your chair, feeling the weight of your feet on the ground, and centering your attention on this part of you that avoids conflict. And then what I'd like you to do is just notice where or around your body that shows up. And don't overthink it, just gently notice. Just do a little scan and just see if it's landing anywhere or around your body. And if something's coming up, you can share it. And if that's not coming up, that's okay too. And checking in with your breath. Is anything coming up?
Yeah, I notice it kind of just feels in my head.
In your head. Okay,
Yeah.
great. And then what I'm wondering, as you focus your attention on this, what are the thoughts and or feelings that are connected to it? Again, without editing it, just like, what are the thoughts and feelings that you have around this avoiding conflict when it comes up?
Worrying about disappointing other people.
Okay. So worrying about disappointing. Anything else?
Now that I think about it, if I'm experiencing anger from somebody else, maybe a heaviness in my chest.
Okay, so it lands in your chest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. So it lands in your chest, and then you worry about disappointing others.
It's sort of a feeling of doom, like it feels unescapable.
Okay.
If I'm in the middle of some kind of conflict.
Okay. So like this feeling of doom, like, oh my gosh, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
It's over. There's no ability to escape. I'm not going to be able to get through this. So when you think about that, like worry about disappointing, this feeling in your chest and this feeling of doom, are there any other emotions that come up for you then with this?
I would say overwhelmed is something that I experience.
Yep. What else? Any other emotions when that anger is coming at you and you're feeling kind of overwhelmed and that you might disappoint?
I think those are the main things.
Okay. And then what I want you to do, I want you to check in with this part of you and just ask it if there's anything that they or it would like us to know about that. Anything else, everything, just anything that comes up.
Okay.
What else is important?
And do I ask it directly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what else?
Is coming up. And
What else is coming up for you?
Try to experience it like where you feel it in your chest and you feel this feeling of overwhelming, and just kind of check in with that part.
Okay.
Just like you did. You just did a beautiful job. So what else? What else does this part need us to know? What else is important?
just worried that something bad will happen, that it will somehow that things will get worse, that things will be irrecoverable if something bad happens.
Yeah, so that's a lot. That's a lot to be carrying, this deep feel, that worry something bad will happen and that it's unrecoverable. It almost sounds like there might be a little fear attached. Yeah, okay. And then I'm wondering if you could just reflect for a minute and go inside and sit with this part for a minute and just identify, how long has this part been around? Like, how old were you when it first showed up? And just go with whatever comes. No editing.
Certainly as a child, I don't remember how old.
Like rough.
Maybe latency age, 12 or 13.
Okay, great. Perfect. Yep, because whatever comes up is the answer. Okay. And so when you think about this tendency to want to avoid conflict, and you worry about disappointing people and feeling this sense of doom and overwhelm and fear, and you're carrying it in your chest, and that you worry, like, this part wants you to know that worry that something really bad will happen and things will get worse or maybe even unrecoverable. When you think about all this, how do you feel towards that part of you? How do you feel towards that part now that you've explored this a little bit more? What are your feelings towards it?
I guess compassion for just feeling so much weight.
Yeah. Anything else?
Maybe with compassion with some concern as well.
Concern, yeah. And is there anything that you would say to this part, this 12 or 13-year-old? Like if he just walked in the room and he was worried about all these things?
Nothing immediately comes to mind.
Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to have us gently transition out of this exercise. I'd like you to keep your eyes shut for a moment and just, once again, just check in again with yourself or this part and see if there's anything else that's unfinished or needs to be addressed. Doing a scan with your body. Checking in. And I'm just going to ask you if there's anything else that's coming up.
I don't think so.
Okay. So now what I'm going to ask you to do, Lance, is to reconnect, kind of come back to the here and now by feeling the weight of your body in the chair and the weight of your feet on the ground. Checking in with your breath, really bringing yourself back to the present moment. Yeah, nice. And whenever you're ready, gently coming back into the room.
Okay.
Beautiful. So there's a lot cool about this, and I'd just like to hear a minute about what your experience was with this, and then I'll share just a couple of observations.
I think it was just, it was interesting how the guidance from you could get me plugged into that part of me so quickly. That was, and things these are things that I've thought about before, but some stuff came up that I hadn't really thought about, and that was super interesting to me.
Yeah, and that's what's so powerful about some of these somatic processes, right? Because if I had just tried to have this conversation with you, it wouldn't have gone this way. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so powerful about this. And then what's really beautiful about this is that you experienced unblending. And unblending occurs when you can have compassion for the part. And that was the word that you used. So when I asked you, how do you feel towards that part, you said compassion. Mm-hmm. And that's the beginning of the unblending. And when we're blended with our parts, we can't see the difference between us and the 12 and 13-year-old. And now with the unblending process, you know that that's probably a younger part. And so you can give them a little love. And you can say, hey, I got this. I'm a grown man. I can see that this is scary for you. Is there any way you could just soften a little bit here? Do you trust me enough? So that's how you would continue to do that parts work with people, and keep going deeply. But you were a very great client in this role play, because it could go anywhere, right? You have to go into these, and this is a really weird spot to be doing this, and it was a big ask. But I thought it would be cool to do it because I thought it would be cool to do it. And this is something that I've been working on. And I find it a really powerful intervention, a non-pathological way to deal with some of these younger parts. And that's what's so cool about, speaking of fitting with social work values and ethics, everything about their trainings are totally grounded in social work principles and values. And starting with, I think, we were talking about the book, No Bad Parts, and what that really translates to do is no pathology. Mm-hmm. Everything makes sense. Everything makes sense once we understand it, and our job is to get curious about it and understand the why or what's happening. Or in this case, a 12 or 13-year-old, of course, who can't have compassion for a 12 or 13-year-old that's afraid and feels overwhelmed by conflict? I mean, tell me that's not easy.
Right.
And then you're just so able to go right. I mean, it was really cool that you were so able to, show that compassion, because then just one more piece and then I'll be quiet. That shows that your true self came on. That's your capital S self. Because,
yes, I know that's an important part of IFS.
Yeah, there's like the 8 C's, and one of them is compassion. The first one's compassion and caring, curiosity, creativity, and I don't know what the other 4 are, because that's about as...
That's a lot to remember. So.
Right. But that's what you're looking for as a therapist. And sometimes when I'm working with people and I'll say, how do you feel towards that part? And they'll say, I can't stand it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's data, right? We have more unblending to do. You're still really, and that's totally okay. There's no judgment whatsoever. It's just really cool that this ended up working out, and we had no idea because we didn't practice this role play.
Well, and hopefully it feels like validation of my own self-reflection that I was able to have some compassion for a part that I've definitely explored throughout my lifetime. So.
Most definitely. Well stated. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that role play.
Thank you.
And let's see, to wrap up, I guess one of the things that's just on my mind is we've really been through a tour de force of not just your experience, but really the landscape of clinical social work practice. You've done a lot of work in this area. And so for listeners, I don't want them to feel overwhelmed by because you're at the end of your career.
That's
and
right.
You've had all this stuff you've been able to build up over the years.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a great example too of how we take these good things that we learn, and then we have that part of ourself that we use in our practice, and we have to decide which theories and models really kind of fit with the way we do our practice. And I get the sense that you've really worked hard on that throughout your whole career and really taken those things in that have helped you develop your practice. Well, thank you so much, Jane. As we close today, I want to thank Peter Monahan and all others who have worked with him in the studio to make this podcast possible. Additionally, I express my gratitude to the University of St. Thomas for providing the resources for this show. And finally, again, a special thank you to Jane for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lance. It's a pleasure.
Take care, everyone.